In the beginning, I can tell you that we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what was happening. And the reality is everything we did, as you've heard in the past, did not work. So I consider myself one of the world's leading experts on what doesn't work. And in doing so, fortunately, I grew up and matured in an era where in 2001, the human genome was sequenced or deciphered. So suddenly, out of all of the frustration and the turmoil of trying to measure what was happening inside the human body, we suddenly had this phenomenal tool. I think that if you want to look at the greatest advance in the history of medical science, it's probably the sequencing of the genome. It's probably understanding the underlying mechanisms. And let me take a second to talk about this, and I'm not speaking as a high-level researcher. But what we measure most often in science are called correlations. That means that when X occurs, Y is associated with it. One of the fallacies of science is we often believe that that's causal. It's not causal at all. I see some of you nodding, some of you have a scientific background. When we look at DNA, we are looking at, again, the primary mover and shaker, we are looking at mechanism. So we are looking at the actual change or chain of events that's triggering the biological response. And what we decided to do was not look at individual genes, but look at what's called metabolic pathways. What is metabolic pathway? The metabolic pathway is basically that cascade that I was talking about to begin with. It's basically the series of events that occurs triggered by a DNA change of multiple genes, and there are several genes that are active in each one of these pathways. And what's really interesting over here is that the genes that got turned on during the experimental phase or during the stress phase did not necessarily reverse in the music-making phase. Now you're probably saying to yourself, oh, that's an abject failure. You probably missed something. How could we not turn off those stress genes? And what we were able to discover for the very first time, which was not only a music contribution but a scientific contribution, is that the upregulation or the stress pathways were mitigated by entirely different pathways to bring about the relaxation response. During relaxation, only 2 pathways showed a significant change in expression in the control group. 12 pathways showed statistically significant changes in the experimental group. And these 12 pathways are critical in the context of understanding coronary vascular disease. Some of those pathways have to do with blood clotting. And for those of you who might not be familiar, a heart attack or a stroke is associated with diminished blood flow to a specific area of the heart or brain, with the resultant death of that tissue. And sure enough, we could see that using a recreational music-making activity, we could turn on pathways that were not only formidable, but were also pathways that were critical to maintaining our health and well-being.